Hi guys, I'm Yaku. I'm your host for Forging Men, a place where iron sharpens iron. And today I've got Grant with me. And so I'll let Grant introduce himself a little bit. We met about almost 2 years ago.
Yeah, almost 2 years ago.
When I started attending what I thought was a gender-based violence workshop, which had nothing to do with that essentially, and really introduced me into the space of trauma-informed spaces, let me call it that. Which I found really fascinating, mostly because I started understanding myself more in that journey. And so, it's just been fascinating. And so there's, the reason why I just wanted to have a conversation is just really about what I've experienced around understanding more about trauma and the effects on me, and therefore, what it does in the space of masculinity. But I'll let you give you a little bit of intro on yourself there.
Okay. So Grant Steward, I'm currently sort of director of a one-man show, so a one-person show called R-Cubed, to Restore, Reconnect, Rebuild. But I do have some colleagues, and we started this almost 10 years ago, looking at how do we take the understanding of trauma that had developed into a broader setting. So my kind of long-term background goes all the way back, a lot of it in youth work, but working years of doing teen camps, working in schools, then in communities and prison, and then doing training. And my colleague, Lane Benjamin, she worked a lot in Hanover Park and developed a lot of the understanding of trauma. So I've learned a lot from her kind of perspective, and brought the real theory into understanding what is trauma, intergenerational trauma, what does it mean then to be trauma informed. I brought my own ideas just because of working with guys. I spent a number of years in places in Manenberg, for instance, working with some community members, looking how do we reach young men that are which had actually been left, the kind of organizations, and in some cases, on most of the churches had said, well, we work with this group, that lot, we don't. Like they lost, essentially. And so we had gone, and so I got educated on the streets. I had a lot of book knowledge, but not a lot of street smarts. And that, but also then reading a lot and understand, how do we understand, how does someone end up in gangsterism, or someone end up in violence, and especially from a place like Manenberg it's not everyone is in gangs, not everyone is violent, and so we create this whole myth around a community as well. So I want to at least play that down. But we did interact. There are gangs there, and that is a reality. But why does someone end up there? And they have to ask different questions. They're not inherently bad. And so those are the things that shaped my questions. Lane's stuff helped him, between Lane's stuff and other people I was reading, helped me understand it. And I brought a lot of that into the work around trauma-informed thinking. And so, so that's kind of, and so I do a lot of training processes stuff, whether it's in schools, organizations, communities at the moment.
So I want to make sure that we get back to some of the points that we talked about, and even before we were talking a little bit about stuff. So a lot of this got to do with identity, and I want to talk about that whole thing about why do we go into violent spaces where there's a collective rather than me as an individual. We spoke a little bit about that, and I found that fascinating. But also just the general effect on trauma. And so I think what interests me about this is that, you come with a lot of knowledge about this, but a lot of that knowledge is, partly book knowledge, but a lot of it is also just practical experience. And I think that's where the big value lies on this. For me, it feels like I've just dipped my toe into this space, which is strange because it sounds like trauma is the one place you want to stay away from. And I think generally that's what happens.
Yes.
I think for us as men. So that to me is probably the one thing that I find the most fascinating, is just as I discovered more as we stepped into this, just my own experiences in it. And it's like I was thinking, at the end of this, I'm going to have knowledge to deal with And yet, from the beginning, it was just like, well, the only knowledge I'm having is being informed about trauma and how it affected me, and understanding things. And of course, then listening to some of the stuff you were saying about just the practical, the physical aspects, like what happens with my body and my brain. It's like, oh my word, it's I think what drew me into this was just how fascinating it was to understand myself. But what it did open for me is the fact that we don't understand trauma at all. And so, and maybe I'm generalizing, but I can because I'm talking out of my own experience. Like, I did not understand this. And I think men in general, the more I talk to men and the more I spend time in the space, I just realize that you have no clue. Like for me, when you talk about trauma, the first picture comes up is like, I'm in a violent car crash, or I'm being assaulted, or, there needs to be guns and stuff involved for me to have a traumatic experience.
That's right,
So then I'm like, oh, that was trauma. I didn't realize that just like life, if I look at my own life, just like, you mentioned, we were talking at one of the workshops, we were talking about chronic trauma. And I was like, oh my word, that made sense to me. And so I want to start there because I think, for me, that was valuable. I think because men are not engaging in deeper conversations around this, it is something that we like, I think it's part of the cowboys don't cry. Like, no, man, nothing is traumatic. And tonight when I'm sitting at home, or the lights go out and I'm with my head on my pillow, like if I have to think about my day, there were traumatic experiences in my day. And I think the reason why we break so violently at some point is because we just don't take care of understanding this. So I really want to talk a little bit about that, because for me that was just fascinating. And so maybe let's talk a bit about what are those things how does it happen? I mean, I remember you explaining just practically what happens to your brain and there's a lot of F's in the fight and flight. There's now a lot of things in there, but just typically, because I think for us as men, that's that's what we're used to. And so if we have a deeper understanding, it just maybe makes us more trauma informed in a way.
I mean, it's such a big topic to cover in such a short time. I mean, maybe to start off with, you're right about the thing about trauma. So because the sort of narrative around trauma has been so shaped by a particular, let's call it a biomedical Western concept of trauma, which places it in this idea of you having to have experienced, as you mentioned, a significant event, and then there's this post effects that happen. That's valid. Like there's validity to that because there's enough people who've experienced that. The bigger challenge though is when people are experiencing traumatic or high toxic stress, chronic stress, some of those things there's a bit of a continuum there. When they experience those things on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, generationally stuff, how do we then understand trauma? And often then a particular model that talks about significant events and stuff, what happens, the way people adapt to a continually threatening environment will show up differently. And then we lose sight of that. So
because then also what would be a tremendous spike as a traumatic event becomes just a normal day-to-day living environment. Right. So what would need to be a spike would be an unbelievably something that will put someone else pretty much in hospital will be for this person just like this is.
So we now have to adapt, call it a maladaptation, but now we adapt to a world which is threatening, continually threatening, and how does that shape us? And that's important because that has a whole lot of knock-on effects around how we show up in the world, how relationships happen.
Is there a very strong link between that and violence?
Yes. So if we go to the brain, as you're saying, it's always a hard one because brain is such a complex thing and it's always wrong, almost feels wrong to reduce it down to a simple thing of 3 parts. But that is the kind of easier way for us, or the accessible way for us to start to understand how things happen.
For me, you're going to have to draw pictures.
The
simpler the better.
So the psychiatrist, neuroscientist Dan Siegel uses a hand model for the brain. And I know some other guys don't like the hand model, but we won't go into the not the debate around is it an effective way of explaining it or not. But it is to some degree helpful in the sense of if we had to say the rest was our brainstem, so the part of our brain, the thumb in the middle was our middle brain, limbic system or emotional brain, and the top end of our fingers is the thinking, the cortex brain. If we
so the peak would be
in the middle brain, it's the emotional brain. Yeah. So, I mean, it's an integrated brain. There's no such thing as like 3 different brains, but it's sometimes helpful to think about it as different these different parts. And so, some important facets in that the brainstem, which is sometimes known as the survival brain, is the first part of your brain that develops as you grow. I mean, all parts of the brain are kind of there to develop, but the survival brain or the brainstem is usually really functioning before we're born. So that part's on, and that is our survival brain.
Yeah.
It's there to keep us alive and all the things that we need to be kept alive. So it's how a baby tells their caregivers they are hungry, thirsty, etc., etc. They don't have a language for it. All they know is there's distress, and so we cry. And the parent's job is to figure it out, right? You're like, smell the nappy? No, not food today. It's I think okay, not that one. Is it cold? Still crying? No. And so figuring that out, and the responsive nature of parents helps that child grow and helps them to regulate themselves. But that's what's happening. The survival brain is getting in distress. It communicates. And so what we're seeing is behavior from a baby that is communicating distress. And we need to find ways to deal with that distress and regulate it. As the baby grows, or as the child grows, their emotional brain starts to develop more and more. And it really kind of reaches its, as I understand it, reaches its kind of real development stage by around 12 years old, as we hit in early adolescence.
Yeah. Stop there for a second.
Yeah.
I don't know, like a whole other conversation that's probably we're going to have to have. So if you talked earlier about how trauma makes us show up in the world. So the caregiver, so say mom is going through traumatic experiences. Now having to figure out this little tick box list of, smelling old woman. That trauma would then also have a major impact because like her trauma would be showing up in that world. Like, can't deal with this, can't cope with this. And so completely almost disconnecting or, all kinds of different things, which then has kind of knock-on effect. Okay.
Yeah, entirely. So if I just quickly, I'll come back to that point. So the limbic system and then our top brain, our thinking brain, it's the brain where all our language develops, where our impulse control, you name it, all that kind of stuff is something that really grows and develops. It hits its biggest formation period during your teenage years in many ways. And reaches some kind of developmental maturity by about 25. Right. The interesting thing, the way our brain works is your survival brain is about survival. It is, so when we are under threat, the survival brain comes online, and the more under threat we are, the less access we have to our thinking brain.
So it shuts down.
So as we go into higher levels of stress or fear or stuff, we shut down the thinking brain.
Because realistically, there's certain things you don't have to think about. You just have to run.
Like
little thing is like left or right running, but running.
That's right. The main point is to get away. Right. There's no time for philosophical, strategic thinking and discussion. Where we just got to get out of there, or fight, or freeze. And play dead. So those are parts of who we are. They're wonderful things to keep us alive. In a world in which we don't often face that kind of like obvious threats, stress becomes our threat. But as we go back to that infant thing, or the child who's got a mother who's stressed, if the mother is, or parents or whatever, are highly stressed for whatever reason. So there's lots of possibilities for that. It could be work-related, finance-related. It could be because the environment in which they live in is chaotic, et cetera, et cetera.
talking about the basic, simple, like sleep deprivation,
Yeah.
new kid kind of
Yeah, all
phase.
that. I mean,
it's like small on the scale.
Yeah. So higher stress levels, the less I'm able to be present for my child, right? I can create, that child starts to develop their own adaptation to a world. And the higher the stress levels, the higher stuff is, and depending on the history of the parents themselves and the way they were raised and their context, that's why we get the intergenerational trauma. Because for instance, if a mother had their own negative experiences when they were growing up, they lacked maybe attachment or stuff to their own mother. They might, unless, there was intervention and they found, they received some level of love and stuff along the way that helped to undo some of that. Often that lack plays up in their own child's life. And if you add highly stressful environments to that, that can intervene in that.
Highly stressful pregnancy would
transfer things like cortisol and those kinds of stress hormones into the child.
Baby kind of grows up in like soup of stress almost.
Yeah, a child might actually, in that sense, the unborn child might arrive in the world with a kind of vigilance.
Okay.
I kind of make the joke, it shouldn't really be, but the joke of a baby popping out ready to fight, pop the doctor one.
Ready for it. Yeah.
Ready for it. And so then they can be interpreted as a temperamental child.
Yeah.
And so, but all those things means, because your survivor brain is the one that's online, kind of is developed when you're younger, and you are experiencing high levels of stress. And the neuroscientist Bruce Perry talks about the difference between good stress and bad stress. So there's good stress that's kind of, we all need stress to grow and change. Stress is part of our lives. Stress in itself is not the bad thing. It's the type of stress. So the good stress is something that's not prolonged. It's temporary. It's it's of a limited nature, that kind of stuff. Bad stress is prolonged. It's extreme. It's unpredictable.
Can you give an example of good stress?
So a good stress might be even the thing of a mother leaves the room. Baby gets upset. Right? So stress levels go up. Right? But mother's just gone out briefly and she comes back in. And then attends to the child, responds to them, loves them. So that stress was temporary. Eventually it becomes predictable, because mother sometimes leaves the room. As the child of infant develops object permanence, they start to know that she hasn't disappeared forever. Starts to recognize that she will come back. She gets comforted, or he gets comforted by the mother. And so there's a certain level of security there. So that stress level helps the child develop a level of trust and sense of.
So we need that.
The person's not going to go away forever.
Yeah. Right.
That will happen, but they will come back. I'm not being abandoned. And so that kind of grows. I don't really like the word resilience. It grows the kinds of grit and trust in the caregiver, that they haven't disappeared. And so that's, it was temporary. It wasn't nice. But the bad one is when things like that happen and we don't know when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And it happens, maybe that the mother wanders off and doesn't come back for prolonged period, or those kinds of things start to develop stress reactions that they then start to what they call sensitize the stress response system. And the more you sensitize the stress response system, the less stress you require to trigger a response.
Okay. So that's like abandonment when you start setting in there. Because this grows, it's, as you're growing older, that kind of stress would then be a bad stress.
Yeah.
Like you being abandoned. Like often conversations with the boys about fathers being absent, and they're looking forward to father coming and he's promising, and it just never happens.
It never happens. Yeah.
Kind of your resilience, what you build there is like, okay, well, he's just not going to.
Yeah.
So keep on hoping, but it's just not going to happen.
So then you have all kinds of different responses.
Yeah.
So if we just use the fight, flight, freeze thing, there are behaviors that are connected to those three areas. that respond to stress like that. And as people, we respond in different ways. I sometimes think we have a tendency, for whatever reason, I'm not sure what, but some are a little bit more fighter-like, some are more flighter-like. That freeze dissociated response is a little bit more kind of when you can't do anything about it,
Yeah.
when it's too overwhelming.
Let's jump a little bit just into later development stages. I want to ask if you would agree to the statement I heard a while back that girls typically are more resilient than boys in those early development stages, especially around trauma and stress. And the study was done just with children in children's homes, for example, even with sexual trauma and stuff. And they found that girls generally were more resilient, part of maybe just their development stages being earlier, but then also because that was linked into the fact that boys tend to be more depressed, even at a younger age, which is not very obvious because we don't talk about it. So it kind of linked into that whole we're not talking about. But there was a good argument that girls tend to be more resilient at a younger age.
Yeah. I don't know that, so I wouldn't be able to comment per se on that. The one thing I'd ask some question is, what do people mean by resilience? So one of the things that's often, that's why I don't like the word resilience.
Yeah.
It's because there's not a clear, what do we mean when we say someone's resilient?
So a prolonged study could be they cope better, but that might just be a very unhealthy coping mechanism.
So they become an adaptive response in certain ways. And, they often say in certain communities where there's high levels of poverty or violence, those people are so resilient. They've learned to cope.
Yeah.
Resilience, and that way we can ignore the system that oppresses and hurts and commits violence. And so
good coping way would be to handle the stress that comes in, which then whatever stress it is would mean I'm growing stronger in this space.
Yes.
And I'm going to deal with it better. Where we're not coping with it well would be, it's like, I don't know what to do with this. Maybe because I'm not at that stage where I know, or there's no one around me to help me to guide with it. And I'm kind of just getting into and then it becomes very clear fight and flight responses.
Yeah. So, and that kind of develops over time. So
I would imagine any fight or flight response would be coping with stress in a unhealthy way.
Yeah. I mean, there's fight or flight, which is our normal response. But if it becomes our default way of responding to any kind of stress, and that becomes, so that depends on how vigilant we are, how sensitized our stress response system. So someone who grows in strength, so someone who's, call it resilient, has had stressful things. So in that sense, someone who's built muscle in a healthy way, stress has happened, but usually the way someone has navigated that in a healthy way is because they've got support structures. And we navigate stress better in relationship and connect. And that is the essence. Like, actually, the studies more saying it's not how much adversity we face that determines how our negative or how we go future. It's actually got to do with our connections, and the healthier and connections in our history of our connections actually helps to, and that's why you're seeing one community where one person seems to succeed and others don't, say, oh, everyone must be like them, but actually they just had a collection of support structures, even if it was just one.
So it's the idea of one person standing on the rock and the wave comes and you have to face it on your own versus two people standing there. Or So the more there's just that, it's creating some response, but I'm not alone in this. Okay.
So it's facing high levels of stress and being loved and cared for and nourished helps us then develop the fortitude for when stress happens again. And then those young people, and it doesn't matter what's community, what your background is, actually you are then better able to cope with stress in the future, dysregulate less, etc., etc.
So I want to just come back to that, what you said there about because we see that so often, and in the work I do with the boys at the Character Company, it's so clear. Out of my own life, for me, flight has been the response, because of no support structure.
Yeah.
And actually part of it was never realizing that I could cope with stuff. So for me, somewhere early on, it was just a question of like, just get out of here. And so like even healthy, healthy conflict, is that a word? Like even healthy conflict is something that I don't understand. So for me, it's just like, I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
And yet often, and I see that with our boys, but I also see, the guys that are just like you say, ready to just like one wrong word, and it's not just like what's going on here, it's just fight. And we just a response that then started with like, there's no one else here, I have to look after myself. Something happened and I'm responding, and it worked. Okay, so suddenly like and that builds then a space where violence is very, very easy, not because I was born violent, but just because I learned that is a way to cope with regulating my own environment, really.
Yeah. I mean, it is a regulating thing. I mean, committing violence releases kinds of endorphins and stuff like that. So in that sense, it reinforces it, because actually there wasn't it actually helped me feel better.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you've got a culture and ideology that reinforces or teaches or socializes people into violence, that helps that kind of just helps that development of being violent. The other is, like I said, if it actually works. I intimidate, someone moves away, someone backs off. Actually, okay, I've got power over them. So there's that reinforcement. So there's those kinds of things that happen. And somewhere along the line, you develop it. And so you respond to moments and stress, or especially interpersonal interactions, in ways that sometimes can seem like, why did they do that? And we actually think there's something wrong with the person because just over a packet of chips, and they ended up fighting with each other.
Yes. And that brings me, like you raised the question. I think you gave me the reference of this book as well, and it's just been so helpful. It's the whole question of not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So like, that would be the case. It's like, it's not like what's wrong with you while doing this. It's like stopping and stepping back and going, well, what happened here? What created you to have this reaction?
Yeah.
And that just brings about a whole different understanding.
Yeah. I mean, I think if we are going to develop as a empathic, compassionate society, and we are losing that to some degree. I mean, some parts of the world are saying being empathic or empathetic is a sin. I'm like, no. Anyway, but so our default reaction is to say, what's wrong with this person?
Yes.
Yeah. Like, and then we come up with all labels about how bad they are. And instead of asking what has happened to you, why has it happened? Or why is this happening?
Yeah.
And Resmaa Menakem, the sort of American psychologist, talks about, he has this phrase of trauma in a person that has been decontextualized over time looks like personality. So anything up. So that's just, and then he says, trauma in a family that's decontextualized over time looks like family traits. That's just the way they are. It's just that family, that's what they do, kind of thing. Trauma decontextualized in a group, or trauma in a group decontextualized over time looks like culture.
Yeah. Okay.
And again, we just, and then we make stereotypes and myths about a culture, and say there's something wrong when they do things off. It's, and we have, again, labels and stuff, instead of asking different questions. And sometimes that can be hard because we don't always like, there's people we don't like, and things that they do we don't like. I always think about old Putin. And I was listening to someone give a bit of a background about Putin. And one of the stories of his history, I don't know if you know much about Putin's history, but he was born in, I think he was born in 45 or 46, somewhere around there. So his mother was in Leningrad or St. Petersburg, but it was Leningrad at the time, and it was under siege by the Nazis for a long, long time. Thousands of people died from starvation, and his mother, so his brother died at that time, his older brother, and his mother was considered dead. They tossed her onto a pile of bodies. Someone was walking past and heard her breathed in and pulled it out. Right. A year later or so, whatever, I forget exact dates, he was born. So you think like that's the context into which he was born. Add to that the ideology and stuff that he learned along the way. But there's like lots of questions of going, right, can we understand someone with that in mind?
That's true what you're saying. Is like sometimes we just don't want to because that means I have to then change my perception.
Then I must actually have empathy. And the thing I tell people now more and more is having empathy and compassion and understanding is not separate and exclusive from accountability.
Yes.
So I can ask the question, what has happened to you? Why has that happened? But I can still hold you to account for things you've done because, when we've hurt people, and that's all of us, and like, I can understand why I've done something, but if I've hurt somebody, I've got to take responsibility for that. I've got to be held to account for those I've wronged. And then my responsibility, if I know that in myself anyway, is what can I do to make the change in myself so that I don't do it in the future.
Yeah. And I've got such a great story that we had around that and understanding it. And it's a longer story, but essentially just the power of stepping back and going, what happened to you versus what's wrong with you, and then having to like almost like my whole framework of how I would typically deal with this had to be dismantled, and that was hard work. And part of me just wanted to like, I don't like this, and I don't like your behavior. But frankly, just actually removed you from the space because then I don't have to deal with it. And so all of that to kind of go beyond all of the stuff that you've learned and to go like, okay, what happened here? What is the story behind this behavior?
Yes.
As hard work as it was, had just a phenomenal outpouring and working out for the rest of that story. But if you then look at our context, it's not even a country. It's like, how do we? Because I think there's also, because we don't understand it, and now we have all of this stuff to deal with, and we're going, for us as men specifically, as if I have to understand your story, it means I have to deal with it differently.
Yes.
And I don't know what to do with that. And there's no clear guidelines, and I can't make restitution necessarily. But what you said there was so important. I can change the way that I step forward, which means I will raise my children differently, and my community that I affect will be different, so that we don't repeat this. And so that's a slow process. And we're not really built for slow.
No.
Trauma's not necessarily slow either.
No, I mean, it happens quickly. So our responses are immediate. Fight or flight is not something that is like, it's a very quick response. And part of in the journey, and the reason why often violence happens is because we go there so quickly, and then we go to those reactions which aren't logical, rational, etc. And that's when violence happens. And and that becomes the thing. So if you look in, and then obviously that creates its own cycle of violence,
and trauma.
So we keep. Yes, it's the cycle of trauma. The violence
which doesn't stay the same. That grows. It spins faster and it gets bigger, and so. That trauma you spoke about earlier from a culture is then, unless there's some serious intervention, unless there's some serious understanding and dealing with this, being informed about it, that's just going to eventually spiral out of control.
Yeah. And can happen in multiple ways. The way it spirals out, it doesn't always have to be obviously like this violent society, but it can spiral out in a way of oppressing other people. So one group, in the way we deal with our past trauma, is by oppressing someone else and having power over them, because that makes us feel better about ourselves. And then we don't have to deal with our historical stuff, as long as they are under us. But as soon as they start to feel a degree of power themselves, our old history of threat pops up. And so we start responding in ways as a group towards it, thinking they're not actually challenging us as much as becoming like there's an equity that's arising, being equitable, being on equal level. But now, because I'm used to making sure they stay under me because it makes me feel better about myself, I'm now, and that happens at an individual level as much as it is a group level. And so we respond in violence to make sure if we had power over, we really don't want someone coming here.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in domestic violence and stuff like that, and in the GBV space. It's so often a power thing, maintaining power or feeling threatened. And it's often the violence. And that's why that's why when we did the trauma-informed with GBV is we don't deal with GBV unless we deal with the trauma that sits in our society.
Because that's actually important, Sam, because I mean, there's such an interesting conversation around so many different things. And I mean, part of the whole cultural thing is because you also think, there were cultures. I don't know why I'm thinking of the Spartans, for example, that they were just growing a generation of fighters.
Yes.
They're like, if you were a flight there, you were gone. I mean, there's just no space for you.
You were sports.
Not at all. And yet today we see so many violent societies, which is like almost like, you think of the Spartans as a great example. And I mean, we're generalizing it obviously, but, and then there are so many cultures these days that are so bad examples of just violence. And so, it's such an interesting space, but I want to pull this back to something that's so much more relevant to us. And that's what you mentioned there around gender-based violence, because it's difficult to understand it. Like part of me just, like, I can't make the switch to go that you will, and of course, it's just violence in general. I think we're all capable of it, but, just the ability to take violence to women, for example, like I struggle to understand. There seems to be a bridge that I can't cross. And yet, if I understand trauma and I understand the undealt trauma and what that does to me, and then of course, being isolated in that, and then no check behavior, no accountability there, then how does that? So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's so relevant in our society where, the statistics around this is just horrendous. It's destroying our culture, our nation, our futures, abilities to raise family. Everything is just affected by this. And yet I don't think we quite know how to understand it.
Yeah.
Like, where does it come from? And so, so how does that link to trauma? How do we take that connection? Thinking of the old days, like normalist belief, telephones, like, how do you put that
you connect it
in a simpler way?
In a simpler way.
Of this very complex issue, because it obviously has to do with the trauma.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole host of things, and I think history, what is it? I think it's James Baldwin that says, we are our history. And so how does that inform the way and that's from individual level and otherwise. And so if we take it from an individual perspective, I find, I think I've mentioned this to you personally, the book Terence Real, hey, I don't want to talk about it. And
was he reading?
Yeah. So in here, like there, we can look at individual trauma and how that shapes the way a young boy grows up. And that shapes his often, and he often talks about, you'll find this boy grows up, his dad was perhaps violently abusive or alcohol, but was depressed and stuff, took it out on him. And he grows up in a culture that doesn't allow men to express emotions or identify their emotions. And what did he also talk about? Schools where you're encouraged to be at the top, but will always knock you down. Right. So there's this one up, one down. I think he talks about there's this constantly you got to be the top dog, but then there's always this thing of trying to take you down. Right. And so if you are the top dog, you're constantly vigilant to people taking you down.
No time to celebrate.
No. I'm not hyper, and so I must make sure that I stay on top. And so there's no room for empathy and compassion and stuff. My job is to make sure you stay down, so I stay on top. And so there's that kind of mentality, but that also means we disconnect from a trauma perspective. One of the things around trauma is disconnection. We disconnect from ourselves, we disconnect from our emotions, we disconnect from people, and the more we become disconnected, the more violence is a possibility.
Why do we disconnect?
Trauma doesn't allow for it. It's
too raw. It's too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's pain.
Is that almost like a flight response inside of trauma's responses? It's just like, I don't want to deal with that. So.
Yeah, I mean, how long do we have? I think it's It's largely to some degree because our social interactions are largely high up the brain hierarchy. And even though we need people for survival, they often become our greatest threat. And that's the difficulty.
Sure, because I need to build those relationships. And that comes with a whole nother set of challenges.
And so when we are under survival, when we are hypervigilant and stuff like that, it becomes harder to maintain connections because it's not as safe. It's not safe. And that is the issue, is we are born for safety. What often people don't realize is that when you walk into a room full of people, your brain, you might not be consciously thinking it, but your brain is doing the work of, am I safe? And we look at people's bodies, we look at their faces, especially their faces. But body, it's not what you say. We are making interpretation from our past experience, right? We're bringing it in with us. And what your face tells me, your body's doing, how people are mingling and talking, I interpret that. It comes into my interpretive side, which is based on my experience. It's not my logical side. It's something much deeper. And my brain goes, okay, I'm not safe here. I'm already made judgments based on, all right. And so I either leave or I don't engage.
Yeah, build a wall.
Yeah, I build a wall.
The deck is stacked against us in the whole process.
You know, so because we're unconscious about it, but it's because of actually we need to be alert when we walk into a room. Our brains are asking, am I safe? Yeah. And that's why the importance of safety. But also, if I never feel safe, I can't connect with you. Yeah. I can never connect with anyone if I never feel safe, because no trust, transparency, stuff that doesn't happen if I'm unsafe. And if I feel unsafe, I'm more likely to do violence.
But the disconnect will also come in then if I live in that trauma state. I am like, I don't want to go and look for more trauma.
No.
And so I'm actually like, building relationships can be traumatic. There's risk involved, and I'm not going to go and look for risk. So there could be a way of just going, like, because we haven't been taught the value of the connections. We know there's something there, but of course now we're making these connections from the wrong places, and it's messy, and it just reinforces all that. I mean, it just becomes such a mess. So I'm just going, I'm actually not going to do this because the chances, I'm not gambling with that right now. I'll gamble something else, but I'm not gambling with it. Yeah. So I mean, in a way, I'm closing the door on the one thing that will be the most helpful thing.
Yeah. I mean, so we disconnect from everything, including ourselves. We don't listen to what our bodies are telling us. We don't listen to what our emotions are telling us, because it's too difficult. It's too overwhelming sometimes. And so our state of being says we need to control this. But also we have had a culture and ideologies that tell us that emotions are dangerous. Emotions we shouldn't, especially within sort of masculine ideologies of, you know, we don't do emotion.
Yes.
Right. That's weak. It's for women, as they might say. And so what happens also is that we then exclude men that actually are demonstratively emotional, who show the emotion, and we go, oh, they're not real men.
That's right.
So we've decided that's not real manhood, but to our own disservice.
Because it's threatening.
That's threatening. Yeah. Because we don't like to deal with our emotions. Because emotions are a place we aren't, also because we haven't been taught it, we grow up feeling like it's a place where we feel incompetent at. And so as we grow up, there's all that.
And it's not safe either.
No.
Just as I don't want to build, like you said, you disconnect not from other people, but from ourselves. Of course, I don't want to actually deal with this because it's not safe. Like here, it's not safe actually. So nothing here is safe.
So if we go back to the Terence Real book of I Don't Want to Talk About It, is that all these guys have developed these emotions which they've shut down through various means.
So it drives violence, but that also drives suicide.
Yes. So
it drives isolation.
First, you get addictions of all sorts.
Of course, yes.
To try and medicate all the stuff that I'm feeling. So it's, I might take drugs, I might do alcohol, I might just overwork and over-accomplish.
Yes.
I've got to keep succeding.
And we don't like to overwork and over-accomplish things because that just sounds like a healthy thing.
Overworking, that's a sign of a good worker,
Because there's actually a reward there, short term.
Yeah. And it's society says that's all right. I don't know how prevalent it is now, but at one stage it was all right for a guy to be an alcoholic, but not for a woman to be an alcoholic. It was all right for a woman to be depressed, but not for a man to be depressed. And so he makes those distinctions. I think there is a degree to which there is still, guys will be boys, they will drink. And in the book, he talks about how it's only when you switch off that medication, whatever it is, when you turn it off and you expose the stuff that lies beneath. And that's when it's hard, because then the depression emerges or whatever emerges. So that's at an individual level. And often I think that works at group, at cultural levels. We've developed ideologies that speak to that, whether it's theologies, I always talk about. Often God doesn't, even talking about God doesn't feel emotion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's for a long time, God doesn't, and then, so why is God angry if he doesn't feel emotion? Oh no, that's different. That's different, Of
course, we disassociate from that as well.
Yeah. So there's disconnection at multiple levels. And we can see the impact of that everywhere. The way we treat the natural environment is a form of violence. And so as long as we see violence as a simple interpersonal thing, we miss all those other ways that violence happens and that causes trauma, and that disconnection. So we keep reenacting.
Yeah.
And even so there's the individual thing. And the other thing, to go back further, was about the history of how society has dealt with stuff from what, historical trauma events. There's been studies done in Australia and Canada where they looked at indigenous populations, and they went back 6 generations and looked at patterns, and they found overlapping patterns between those two societies, from the way how colonialism came in, the disruption on men, from enslavement, capture, killing, etc., etc. So their presence was removed from society. And now over subsequent generations, that absence, although not necessarily always physical, becomes emotional.
Yes.
So they're present physically, but absent emotionally. And the impact of that over time, they find patterns. And again, it's what happened to them as a community. And you'll find some guys, men further down the line, start to maybe drink, etc. And their actions start to create this absence. Then domestic violence and stuff starts to happen. But when we look at this generation, we put a box around it. Sure, they're so violent, they're alcoholics. So now we label them as as something, again, going back to, there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
All right, so what do we do? I say, oh, well, because they like that, the only thing we can do is remove their children from their home. All right, so we then remove the children because they can't look after their children. But what we're doing is reenacting what happened when children were removed because they didn't fit the English. We had to steep them in the English Western European ways. All right. So you get, like in Canada, with those, what do they call them? The schools. They call them Indian schools. I can't remember now. But where children removed from their homes and they had to learn to be, English. They weren't allowed to do any of their Indian, the Native American or indigenous cultures. They weren't allowed to practice, speak it. They had given different names. The stories, if you go and read some of the stories from Canada, it is just mind-bogglingly something else. The trauma, the wounding, the damage that was done in it there is quite something. Yeah. So if we go over here, so they are incapable of parenting because they got all these things. And so we remove their children. We do it in a different guise, but we're doing the same thing that we did. Yes. And so we keep doing that. We keep, even in Cape Town, we could probably look at ways in which we keep repeating some and reenacting violence from the past.
because we are reactive.
We are.
Because we actually do not want to take the time to ask what
what
why,
happened,
what happened there. So
and also take responsibility. In some cases, the people in power need to take responsibility for what has happened in the past, and how do we resolve that? How do we heal that? And healing doesn't come from having, I don't want to diss the national dialogue, but it doesn't come from dialogue. It doesn't come from thinking differently, because the source of it is in a deeper place. It's in our bodies, it's in our emotions. And we've got to go there and change our thinking. We don't change it just by thinking.
So all of this is really just a cycle, because we've become such a lazy generation, or lazy people, because we actually just don't want to put in the work.
Well, we're traumatized.
So we kind of sit in this trauma because it's become familiar.
Yeah, we microwave to fix it.
Yes,
that's
and we don't want to deal with that.
No.
So I'm going to close this just because if we understand this better, we will deal with this better.
Yes.
And so, if we look at all of the ways that it plays out, and it's very easy to see that, but I don't think we understood. Like, just having this conversation makes me understand so many more touch points. I mean, there's so many conversations out of this about what it is that we need to do. And so obviously it's easy to generalize, and we're not saying that only men are dealing with this, or, but this is a space where we really need to try and address something that is critical to masculinity. And so it comes back to that formula of vulnerability, accountability, commitment. Because, like you say, I mean, like, if there's something we know, it's that conversation is not changing this.
No.
It is hearing stuff, being more informed. So being informed about trauma helps me to go and not just say, well, like, what is going on with you? I just don't want to deal with it. So the easiest way to deal with this is to remove it so that it's not in my space. And that could be either, I'm not associating in friendship, I'm not building anything, or I'm just moving people into prisons. And I'm not saying some of that is not where we are right now and shouldn't happen. For the sake of, I would imagine, a safer society right now. But we're not thinking any further. We're just dealing with this the whole time. We're not doing anything better. So we're not changing something, and it's becoming worse and worse. And we see that. But if we start dealing with this, and if we just start having the true conversations in that vulnerable spaces, that then leads to accountability. Because that is the most critical thing. It's probably the one thing that is so missing from our country, is just the accountability part. Then the commitment then comes to be better versions of ourselves. That would be, I'm more informed about this. I'm going to put in the work. And when I struggle with that, there's someone that's going to hold me accountable because I've been vulnerable. And that goes to all of this stuff, and the isolation, the addictions, the violence. Because the issue is not that you're a violent person. The issue is that you are a traumatized person that uses violence to deal with stuff. And if we can change that, then we get to just make it better. And that's what the next generation of young boys need so desperately.
Yes.
That's what we as a generation of older boys need so desperately, is to be guided into those conversations. To come to a place where I sit around a table with a small group of guys where I feel safe, because safety is obviously what's going to change that.
And not be afraid of that.
And
I think too many men, we have conversations, we have men weekends where we sit around the fire and talk things and have a laugh, but we never really go deeper, because we don't want to go there. It's too vulnerable. And we have to teach young boys and older guys to know what's happening in their bodies. Why do I feel like this? And how do I deal with it? What are different ways of expressing what I'm feeling? What are the emotions that I'm feeling? Can I identify it? Can I become body intelligent or somatic intelligent, whatever the right terminology is? Can I be emotionally intelligent? Because if I can start to identify those things and name it and learn what to do with it, we change things. Right. Because I need to be able to deal with what's pent up inside of me, if no one's allowed me to deal with my anger. And so how do we help young boys develop that way of being, but offering different ways of expressing it? And that's the important thing. I think sometimes we can say, do better, but we don't tell them what better is. And that's the thing, is actually, let's know what's happening here. So when your body feels like that, what's happening? Oh, when I feel like that, I am feeling threatened. I'm feeling unsafe. Or I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that. Okay, what emotion goes with that? Oh, da 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 da. All right, so what do we do with that? Okay, this is what you can do. And we start to do different things. We find different ways of getting that outlet without putting the gun in the hands, without saying. So when you get dishonored by somebody, you don't have to use violence to get that honor back. There are different ways. What are those different ways? And that's where, so I think that's where the hard work also lies, is that we haven't provided the alternatives enough. So we've got a lot more to talk about.
For sure. And lots more to do.
Yes.
I want to thank you for your time. It's been fascinating. There's like 500 conversations out of this. So we'll definitely have some more.
All right.
But thanks for the work that you do in making men more trauma-informed. I mean, like just personally, how that has shaped my life over the last 2 years, just being more. Denial, sounds like a great space, but it never is.
Not in the long term.
No, to be aware of this has been phenomenal for me, and it has shaped a lot of the thinking and stuff that we want to do differently. So thanks.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for being there. The truth is, in the spaces I move, I'm often the lone male. This is still an area where men don't come into space,
and we need to change that.
And so we need to find ways to bring men in.
Sure. Great.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Cheers.